Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to this public lecture. I was telling Dr. Lin that we have a full house. We still have some friends in the back with no seats. If somebody could help bring in some additional chairs. There's room on the side here. I would like to begin and to explain what I intend to do this afternoon. I will take a few minutes to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Justin Lin. I will say a very few brief words about the topic, invite him to speak to us about 45 minutes, and from 6 to 6:30, we will have a Q&A session. First, I want to explain to Dr. Lin that the dean of the school, Kishore Mahbubani, who's a good friend of Dr. Lin, is not able to chair the public lecture today because he's on an overnight trip to Paris. Yes, he flew all night last night to be in Paris today so that he could attend an important meeting with the French Foreign Minister, Laurent Fabius, and he will leave Paris tonight to fly back to Singapore. Kishore and Justin are mutual admirers, and it would have been wonderful if Kishore were here personally to chair this lecture. So Justin, I'm sorry that I'm a very poor replacement for Kishore. So let me go to my second point, which is to praise Justin Lin. I've been his friend and admirer for more than 20 years. When I was in America, some of my American friends, such as Carla Hills, who had served in 2 Republican cabinets as the U.S. Trade Representative and the Secretary for Labor, had mentioned him to me as a world-class economist and as someone with a bright future. He earned his PhD in economics from Chicago University and was the founding director and professor of the China Center for Economic Research of Peking University, Beitang. He held this position for 15 years before the World Bank appointed him as the Chief Economist, a position he held from 2008 to 2012. I should explain that his appointment as Chief Economist of the World Bank is history-making because he's the first Asian and the first person from the non-Western world to have been appointed by the bank as the Chief Economist. Let me now say a few words about the topic. The public lecture today is based upon Dr. Lin's latest book. He has published 23 books. Where's Kanti Bajpai? Kanti, who's the Vice Dean in charge of research of the school, should use this as a benchmark for our colleagues. Dr. Lin has published 23 books, and they are good books. His latest book, published by Cambridge University Press, is entitled Against the Consensus, Reflections on the Great Recession. The Asians are very polite, unlike our American and European friends. In 1997, when we were faced with a crisis, our European and American friends had no hesitation calling it the Asian financial crisis. I don't understand why the world hesitates to call the 2008 crisis the American financial crisis, because it is in truth a American financial crisis which then spread across the Atlantic and infected many European economies. And of course, because of the size and importance of the American economy, the spillover effect affected the whole world economy. The American explanation for the causes of the 2008 crisis, in my view, rather self-serving. The chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, is quoted to have said that the crisis was due to global imbalances. I quote those words. And he accused Asia of excessive savings. In an essay I wrote for McKinsey a few years ago, I reflected on the irony that in 1997-98, we were accused of having too much debt. And now the Americans accuse us of having too much savings, too much surplus. So it looks like we can't win either way. It is a very self-serving explanation. And Dr. Lin, in his very important book, which I read over the weekend, has a different explanation. And we will have the pleasure this afternoon of hearing his explanation. But equally importantly, he has in his book also suggested a way in which the world can prevent the recurrence of such financial crisis. I wouldn't preempt him and explain to you what he has proposed. My friend Professor Donald Low and I had some words upstairs, and he's promised to ask some searching questions of Dr. Lin after the lecture. So will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Lin to the podium?
Well, Tommy, thank you very much for this introduction. And Tommy is a friend I admire for a long time, and so I'm so delighted that he can chair this session on behalf of Kishore. And it's my new book on the global financial crisis. And in my presentation, I like to cover 4 areas. The first one, what was the true causes for this global crisis? And the second one, even after 5 years, the high-income country have not got out of the aftermath of this global crisis. And it's a way out that can help the high-income country at the same time for the developing country as well. And I'd like to propose a solution that is global infrastructure initiative. And to make that initiative works, we should find a way to judge whether the developing country can have a dynamic economic growth or not. Because for infrastructure investment to be self-depreciating, then high growth is necessary. And is there any way for the developing country to achieve that? And last one, as Tommy just mentioned, I'd like to propose a new international monetary system to avoid, to preempt the recurrency of this kind of crisis in the futures. And for the global crisis, as Tommy mentioned, the US and also in academic and in IMF, they attribute the occurrence of this global crisis to the global imbalances. And their argument is like that. Because of large global imbalances, that means the US had a large trade deficit and other countries had large trade surpluses. And those surpluses countries, they use their trade surpluses and accumulate that as their foreign reserve, and use their foreign reserve to buy US Treasury bill. And then because of that, they replace the interest rate in the US. And because the interest rate is so low, so you encourage the housing bubble, equity bubble in the US. And when the US bubble burst, it turned into the global crisis. And the argument seems to be logically consistent. And you can write a model to show that. And the model seems to be so convincing. Okay. And so it's widespread. In academic circles, in IMF, and in the media, they all attribute the global imbalances as the root causes of this global crisis. And what caused the global imbalances to be so large? There are 3 commonly accepted views. The first one was East Asian economies. They adopt some kind of export-oriented strategies. Because they export so much, so they earn large trade surpluses and turn that into foreign reserve. That's one hypothesis. And the second one was East Asian economies learned a lesson in the 1997 crisis. They understood even their economy performed very well, but if they did not have large enough reserve, they may subject to the speculative attacks. And so for avoid that to happen again, they wanted to increase their reserves And the way to increase their reserve is to export more to accumulate trade surpluses. And that was the second hypothesis, that is so-called the self-insurance hypothesis. And the third one certainly was even more widely accepted. That was Chinese government manipulate the exchange rate and made China to be so competitive, and also China run huge trade surpluses and at the cost of the US. All the three hypotheses, you can write the models and use some empirical evidence to test that, seem to be conventions. However, are they the real causes or not? And if we accept these three hypotheses, then the East Asian economies need to be responsible for the global imbalances and also for the global crisis. However, if you look carefully, I think none of the three hypotheses are consistent with a larger set of empirical evidence. Because we know East Asian economies started to adopt export-oriented strategies since the 1950s, 1960s. But before 2000, East Asian economies, their trade were roughly balanced. Yes, they exported a lot, but they also imported a lot. And also, as a result, the trade was almost balanced. And some countries like Korea, in effect, most time run trade deficit. So export orientation does not necessarily mean large trade surpluses. And historical evidence show there was no such a thing before 2000. And you could use a strategy that has been practiced for more than half a century to explain on something only happened in the last 10 years. So we need to look into something else. And the second one, for the self-insurance motivation, yes, East Asian economies, after 2000, their trade deficit, trade surplus all increased. Their reserve accumulation all increased, as the hypothesis predicted. However, if you look, some countries like Japan, it's a reserve currency. Japan did not have any incentive to hold large trade surpluses in order to increase the reserve and for self-insurance, because Japan can print money to pay anything, right? But Japan also increased its trade surplus in a similar pattern as other East Asian economies. And similarly, Germany, well, the euro is also a reserve currency, right? And so they do not have the incentive for self-insurance at all. But if you look into the trade surpluses in Germany, it had the same pattern as other East Asian economies. So you cannot use the self-insurance motivation as a way to explain what happened, in Japan and in Germany. And secondly, if East Asian economies learn a lesson and try to expand the trade surpluses as a way to accumulate reserve for their insurance, then other countries competing with East Asian economies, their trade surplus should reduce. Their accumulation of reserve should also decline. But we found that almost all the developing countries during the same period of time, they all increased their reserve. And how could that happen? So, and moreover, China after 2005, the trade surpluses as well as the reserve accumulation were too large to be explained by this motivation. So I think that this hypothesis seems to be logically very beautiful. But if you put that into a larger empirical evidence, they are not supported. And the most widely accepted hypothesis was the manipulation of the Chinese currency. And in effect, China, starting in 2003, was accused of manipulation of exchange rate and causing the global imbalances. However, if you look, in 2003, the trade surplus in China was quite small. Was only about half of the trade surpluses that China had in 1997 and 1998. But we know that in 1997, 1998, because China did not depreciate its currencies, so everyone said China had an overvaluation of the Chinese currencies. And that kind of perception was continued to be held up to about 2002. And all of a sudden, in 2003, globally, everyone said China undervalued its currency. But if China undervalued its currency, then the trade surplus in 2003 should be larger Then the trade surplus in 1997 and 1998. But in effect, it was smaller. How could that be possible? Okay, Chinese trade surplus became large only after 2005. Okay, but when China trade surplus become larger with the U.S., trade surplus larger with the U.S. after 2005, but China also increased its trade deficit with other East Asian economies, including Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and also with the European countries like Germany. If Chinese currency was undervalued, if you only look in the US, it seems to be right. But how come China also, during this period of time, its trade deficit with the other economy also increased? So again, it's inconsistent with the hypothesis that Chinese currency was undervalued intentionally. And the third one is that there are many other countries, and China appreciates currency about 20% after 2005. But even after Chinese currency appreciated 20%, the trade deficit that US with China also continued to increase. So the appreciation of Chinese currency would not help US to reduce its trade deficit. And also, many other developing countries competing with the Chinese economy. Their product, their export market are competing with China. But however, not only China increased its trade surplus and accumulation of reserve, other countries competing with China also increased their trade surplus and reserve. And how can that happen? Simultaneously. So all these three hypotheses point the fingers to the East Asian economies for the trouble of global imbalances and then for the trouble of the global crisis, right? And when we say the global imbalances, as I said at the beginning, it was the trade deficit in the US and the surplus in the rest of the world. But if you look into the pattern, US started to run trade deficit with East Asian economies in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, for half a century already. And if you look into the data, in the 1990s, 51% of the US trade deficit came from East Asian economies. But in 2000 and 2007, the share of East Asian economies' contribution to the US trade deficit reduced from 51% down to 38%. So that means what? The East Asian economy contribute less and less to the rising of the global imbalances, right? But currently, both in the media or in the policy communities in the US, they all point the fingers to the East Asian economies. So they are pushing some kind of, they are barking on the wrong dog, right? So we need to find something which really can be consistent with all the empirical evidence that we have. And it's very important because we need to find out the causes in order to prevent something to happen in the futures. And I would argue the only hypothesis that can be consistent with everything I said before is that US use its reserve currency status first, and secondly, to run some kind of policy mistakes. And these policy mistakes, one was the financial liberalization started in the 1980s that allowed the financial institutions to have high leverage so they can lend out more monies at a lower cost. And those kind of things certainly will support more speculation type of activities, housing and so on. That's one thing. And secondly was the monetary policy adopted by the US Federal Reserve after the burst of the dot-com bubble in 2001. Because when you have a burst of bubble, certainly you should have a period of recession. But to avoid that, Federal Reserve lower its interest rate 27 times in 18 months and reduce the interest rate from 6.5% down to 1% from in the beginning of 2001 to March of 2003. And with a high leverage and low interest rate, certainly it creates all kind of excess liquidity. And a low interest rate with excess liquidity, certainly it will encourage all kind of speculative type of activities. And the first one certainly is the housing bubble. The housing prices in the US started to increase very rapidly. And with housing prices increased very rapidly, it had some kind of wealth effect. And especially financial innovation allowed the household to capitalize its gain in the housing prices by refinancing and so on. And so it encouraged households to have overconsumption. In the 1980s, the household debt as a percentage of its disposable income was about 70% of its disposable income. By the time of 2006, 2007, it increased to 130%. So there are 60 percentage point increase in the indebtedness of the household. And those kind of money were used to support overconsumption. And also, US at the beginning of 2000 run some kind of budget, small budget surplus. But because of Afghanistan war and Iraqi war, the US government started to run deficit. And both household and the government run deficit. So they need to increase import to support their expenditure. And this kind of thing in the US can be sustained for a long time because US dollar is a global reserve currency. So they can increase money supply to finance their deficit. And that is the key issue. And China, at that time, after 2000, after the accession to the WTO, China happened to be the producer of those type of consumption goods that US household and so on demanded. And that was the reason why after 2002, 2003, when the housing bubble in the US became larger and larger and overconsumption in the US started to occur, then China ran a huge trade surpluses with the US. And this kind of situation not only affected the trade, but it also encouraged a lot of speculative capital outflow from the US through the capital account. Because in 2000, the outflow of capital to the developing country was 200 billion. But it increased 6 times to 1.2 trillion by the time of 2007. And due to the excess liquidity and low interest rate in the US. And this kind of outflow of capital certainly supported investment, consumption, investment, both reinvestment and also speculative type of investment like housing bubble and so on in the developing country. So during that period of time, there were a lot of consumption and investment growth in the rest of the world. And as the data show, developing country after 2000, they entering into a period of most rapid growth after the Second World War, supported by this kind of large inflow of capital. And since the developing country, they receive a lot of capital from high-income country, either through the capital account or through the current account, and they invested a lot. And when they make investment, certainly they require capital import. And so that's the reason why Japan and Germany and other high-income countries, at that time, they also increased their export of their capital goods. And when you made a lot of investment, at the same time, a lot of consumption, certainly demand for resources, including raw material and like oil and so on, also increased. And so you can see there was a commodity boom during that period of time. But, but the issue is that for the developing country or for the non-reserve currency country, no matter the reserve accumulated through the capital account or the current account, they cannot use the reserve domestically, right? If you put the reserve domestically, you just put that in the shares. So if they want to earn some kind of return on the reserve, they need to use that to make investment in the reserve issuing country. So you can see a lot of flow back of the reserve back to the US. And currently, the academic circle only see the second half of that. They only saw that the reserve accumulated in the developing country or in East Asian economies flew back to the US. But those kind of reserves can only be created by the US, right? Non-reserve currency country cannot create a reserve, right? They can only earn that, those money printed by the US, either through financing of their trade deficit or capital outflow. And so I think that academic circle now only look at the second half, and so they point all the fingers to the East Asian economy. But if you put the whole picture, we all know the only thing that can happen with all those evidence I assemble, that is this kind of global imbalances was created by the reserve currency country, utilize its reserve currency status and with some kind of policy mistakes. And that is the only possibility. And so from what I see, the global imbalances and the global crisis had the same root, all in the reserve currency status as well as the policy mistakes. And certainly, here I need to explain how come China stands out. As I explained, in after 2000, most of those kind of labor-intensive consumer type of goods relocate, its production relocate from Japan and other East Asian tigers to China. And so you can see, East Asian economies before 2000 used to run a huge trade surplus with the US. And after 2000, when they relocate those kind of production to China, their trade surplus with the US decline. But those kind of production are in general processing trade. And China need to import a lot of raw material intermediate goods from other East Asian economies, and that's the reason why, when China run huge trade surpluses with the US, China also run huge trade deficit with the rest of East Asian economies. Well, so we know what was the reason for the crisis. But unfortunately, I agree with that, Tommy, it was American financial crisis. But America has the reserve currency status. And America is still the largest economy in the world. So, when US had a crisis, when US had a sneeze, the rest of the world have a cold. Right? We know that. And so on, the African country has not fully recovered from the global crisis because in the past, when an advanced country was hit by the crisis, after the crisis, they used to have 7% or 8% growth rate, bounce back. But this time, no matter it's in the US or in the European country, they are struggling with 2% or less growth rate. And certainly, now the global attention is on the Southern European countries' sovereign debt crisis. And we know that without structural reform in those crisis hit countries, then any kind of short-term help, short-term package is some kind of painkillers. The similar problem will come back, 3 months, 6 months, or 9 months later. And when they come back in general, the seriousness of those kind of crises will be even larger. And the necessity to carry out a structural reform in a crisis country is a common sense. Everyone agrees that. But it's very hard to implement. The main reason is that structural reform in general is contradictory. Because if you look into the contents of the structural reform, first, reduce the wage rate. The second one, reduce the welfare package. The third one, deleveraging in their financial system. And all these three means you are going to reduce your consumption and your investment. And if you reduce your consumption and investment, certainly the growth rate will drop, unemployment will shoot up, but they already have such a high unemployment rate. So it's very hard to implement. So when the crisis, when the sovereign debt crisis country, when they came to ask for help at the IMF or ECB, they will promise that they will carry out structural reform. But once they return from, they forget that. And that kind of things happened repeatedly in the past 4 years. In the past, there was a way out. In the past, IMF in general recommend, on the one hand, carry out structural reform, on the other hand, devalue your currency. And if you devalue your currency, you can increase your export. And use the increase in export to create a space for the structural reform domestically. But this time, for the Southern European country, they did not have that option because they do not have their independent currency. Then you can say, Euro could be devalued, right? Devalue. And to create the export market for the Southern European country, right? Theoretically, it's possible. But reality, it is impossible. Because the US has a similar problem. Japan has a similar problem. They are all high-income countries. Their products are competing on the global markets, right? If Southern European countries wanted to use devaluation as a way to create a space for their structural reform, it will be at the cost of US. US unemployment rate, real unemployment is still very high, right? Although official unemployment dropped from more than 10% down to now about 7.4%. But that's only statistical sense, right? Because in the US, if a labor lose their job and this worker does not actively seek work within 1 month, then this worker will be considered as dropping out the labor markets. And he will not appear in the unemployment statistic, right? So if we use another measurement, the employment rate for the working age population, then this employment rate in the US still at the historical low. So, and the US also needs to carry out structural reform in order to resume its competitiveness. But for the similar reason, the US has not carried out structural reform yet. And Japan, for the similar reason, did not carry out structural reform for the past 23 years already. So most likely, I think all the high-income countries are likely to be trapped in a situation called new normal. Very slow growth, very high unemployment rate, and during this period of time, the government needs to have a lot of social spending in order to maintain social stability. And the government deficit will be accumulated very quickly, just like Japan. In 1991, Japan's government debt as a percentage of GDP was only 60%, now more than 240. So the similar situation is going to occur, I would say, most likely in the US in the coming 10 years, in the European country in the coming 10 years. And the reason for that is because there's no way to create a space for their structural reform. And without structural reform, they cannot resume to the dynamic economic growth. And so if we want to have a way out, can we find some kind of new initiative that can create a space for the structural reform in the crisis-hit US, Japan, and the Eurozone? And I would like to propose the Global Infrastructure Initiative is a possibility to create space for the structural reform in a crisis-hit country. Because if we have bottleneck religion productivity enhancing infrastructure investment, this kind of investment in the short run will create a demand and a job and a growth. In the long run, it will enhance productivities, and so the government revenue will be increased, and they can pay back the debt now, so it can be self-depreciating. But the opportunity for this kind of bottleneck religion productivity enhancing type of infrastructure investment in the high-income country is rather limited, because by definition, high-income country, certainly they still have some room for improvement in their infrastructure, but the room is very small and may not be large enough for them to carry out large investment and to generate the space necessary for their structural reform. But the developing country has a lot of those kind of opportunity, right? If you go to any developing country, to some extent, except for China, you can see infrastructure bottleneck everywhere. So they have good investment opportunities. But certainly, the developing countries are constrained by the ability to make those kind of investment. Because if you want to make those kind of investment, you need to import capital goods from high-income country. My study show a developing country, if they want to make investment for $1, they need to increase the import of 70 cents. Half of that will be coming from the capital goods from the high-income country. So that means they need to have a foreign reserve. But most countries, their foreign reserve position is not strong enough. And so now we are in a situation. Developing country have many good opportunity for this kind of bottleneck reduction, productivity enhancing type of investment. And if they can carry out this kind of investment in large scale, they can create a space for the high-income country to carry out structural reform. But they are constrained by their funding ability. High-income country, they are facing the dilemma. If they do not get out of this kind of deadlock, their unemployment will be maintained at high levels. The government deficit will accumulate quickly like Japan, and those kind of deficit will be monetized, right? So they will have to print the money to pay the government deficit. But they have another alternative. Why not print the money to help the developing country to make this kind of infrastructure investment and create a job, create an opportunity for them to carry out structural reform. And this kind of opportunity will be a win-win situation because it can help the developing country to avoid the lost decades, and it can improve the productivity of the developing country so they can narrow the gap with the high-income country. And this is also good for the private sectors because under the new normals, the pension fund, sovereign wealth fund, they did not have a good opportunity for investment. But if there's some kind of good design of the infrastructure project, it can be another asset classes for their investment. So I think it's a win-win for all parties. And I guess, I propose G20 can be a forum to discuss those kind of initiatives. And in effect, we also have institutions to carry out those kind of projects. World Bank and Regional Development Bank, their mandate is to help the developing country to improve their infrastructure and growth, right? So I think here that we have the money there. Those money will be spent in effective way or ineffective way. Money is there because they can print the money. Opportunity is there, but we need to have a vehicle. So that's my proposal. But my proposal will work. Depends on the project will be self-dictating. That means the project is a good project. And for infrastructure project to be good project, then that depends on the intensity of use of the infrastructure. If you have a high intensity of use of infrastructure, then the project will be good project. If you have low intensity of use, then it will be going to be bad project, right? But intensity of use depends on the growth rate. So that means that whether the developing country with the investment in infrastructure, can they have dynamic economic growth? And if you look into the historical record, it should be very pessimistic. Because from the Second World War to now, only two economies moved from low-income status to middle-income status to high-income status. One is Korea, the other one is Taiwan. Since the Second World War to now, only 13 economies moved from middle-income to high-income status. And among those 13, 8 are European countries neighboring the Western European countries. So their gap with a high-income European, advanced European country were very small to begin with. Only 5, Japan and 4 small dragons. They are non-European countries, moved from the middle-income to high-income status. That means what? Among about 180 developing countries in the world, they were trapped in low-income status or middle-income status in the past 6 or 7 decades. But I think that from what my study, poverty is not destiny. If you have a right idea, right approach, then every country should have the opportunity to grow dynamically. And I'll explain a little bit, and especially I think the rise of China will provide opportunity for other countries to grow dynamically also. And when I try to answer my questions, I always say we need to go back to Adam Smith. But when I say we go back to Adam Smith, I do not mean we go back to the wealth of nation. We go back to the methodology adopted by the Adam Smith. That is an inquiry into the nature and the causes. For Adam Smith, it's the wealth of nation. For us, we try to understand the dynamic economic growth. So what are the nature and the causes of dynamic economic growth in a developing country? And we know that a rapid sustained growth is a modern phenomenon. It did not occur until industrial revolution occurred in Western European countries in the late 18th century. And before that, all the countries in the world were trapped in a very slow growth because according to historical records, the average annual growth rate in the Western European country was 0.05% per year. It took 1,400 years for them to double per capita income. But now it changed to 1%, 2%, and the time required for double per capita income in the advanced country reduced from 1,400 down to now about 35 years. And what made that possible? It was after the Industrial Revolution, there was the acceleration in technological innovation. as well as the acceleration in the structural transformation by the continuous release of new product, new industries. And that was the nature of modern economic growth. And for any country who wanted to have this kind of sustained growth, they need to have a stream of technological innovation and industrial upgrading. Because only by that you can increase your labor productivity, you can increase your income. But there's a difference between high-income country and low-income and developing country. High-income country, they are only global technological frontier, industrial frontier. For them, innovation and upgrading means invention. Invention is very expensive and very risky. For developing country, their upgrading and innovation move inside the global frontier. So they have some kind of advantage of backwardness in their innovation and upgrading. So if they know how to tap into that potential, their growth rate can be 2 times, 3 times of the high-income country. And in effect, all those small number of successful East Asian economies, their growth rate during their catching up stages was 2 times, 3 times of the high-income country. And the reason that it was possible exactly was because of the advantage of backwardness. And so if a country know how to utilize those kind of advantage of backwardness, then they can accelerate growth rate. But one thing is that if you wanted to upgrade your industry, you need to be consistent with your competitive advantages. Then your industry can be competitive. And then if your industry is competitive, you can earn more surplus, you can accumulate capitals, then you can move up for the later to new industry which you have competitive advantages. And so if a developing country, they want to be successful, they need to be, find a strategies that they can grow according to their competitive advantage and also tap into the potential advantage of backwardness. And this kind of pattern is very much like some kind of flying geese. The latecomers move into the industry which the forerunners, and the forerunners move up the industry, and the latecomers gradually move up the industry. Like what we observe, Japan followed the US, and then the East Asian economy followed Japan, and China followed East Asian economies into the industrial leaders. And that is the way for the developing country to be successfully tapping into the potential of the advantage of backwardness. If that was the key to the success of the East Asian economies, I think that there are going to be a dramatic changes in the opportunities. Because if you look into the East Asian economies, China now reached the same stage as Japan in the 1960s, as East Asian economies in the 1980s, because per capita income measured by purchasing power parity in 2009 in China was about the same as Japan in the 1960s, East Asian economy in the 1980s. And Japan in the 1960s started to relocate or open up its opportunity of labor-intensive industry for other East Asian economies. In the 1980s, Japan started, the other East Asian economies started to relocate those kind of labor-intensive processing industry to China. China now needs to do the similar thing because the rising wages in China. But the difference is that Japan in 1980s and 1960s employed 9.7 million workers in Japan's manufacturing sectors. And in 1980s, Koreans employed 2.3 million, and Taiwan about 2 million, Hong Kong about 1 million, and Singapore about 500,000. But this time, China employed 85 million workers in the labor-intensive manufacturing sectors. And the rising wage in China means China are going to lose competitive advantage in those kind of sectors. China will have to relocate those kind of industries to other low-income countries. And the relocation of those kind of industries, if other low-income countries know how to capture that opportunity, then they can grow as dynamically as other East Asian economy. So that's a hope. But we need to have the right ideas. And so I published 2 books about how to capture that ideas. One called The Quest for Prosperity was published by the Princeton University September last year. And the other one called The New Structural Economics. It was published by the World Bank at the beginning of 2012. You need to pay for the book published by the Princeton University, but for the book published by the World Bank, it's downloadable, free. Okay. The last one. We want to avoid the recurrence of a similar crisis, right? As I argue, the global crisis could be so serious. The American crisis could be such a serious global crisis only because US dollars is the major reserve currencies. And it allowed the US to run such a large trade deficit and to, at the same time, to support such a large capital outflow for such a long time. And this kind of global reserve currency combined with policy mistakes in the financial deregulation and expansionary monetary policy was the main the main cause of the problems. And we want to avoid these global imbalances and the global crisis to occur in the futures. Then we need to find a way to address the issue that using the national currency as a reserve currency. Because if you use a national currency as a reserve currency, policymakers always concern only their own domestic needs, but can be at the cost of the rest of the world. And this global financial crisis is a demonstration for that. And another phenomenon we often discuss in academia is the great moderation in the US, right? In the 1980s, 1990s, and up to 2008, the US economy seemed to be much more stable. So we call that great moderation. But at the cost of what? The rest of the world had more crises. Because the US can always print money and to smooth its domestic economy, but when the US printed money, other countries will be affected. And so actually, the great moderation is accompanied by higher frequency of crisis in the rest of the world. And that was the conflict of the interest, the national interest and the global interest. So if we want to address the issue, we need to address that dilemma. Currently, most people discuss about expanding the special drawing right. But I don't think it addresses the issue. Because the special drawing right is a basket of national currencies. And so the conflicts of national interest with the global interest still there, right? So it doesn't help. And so I propose something along the lines of Keynes when he proposed the Banco during the discussion of the international monetary system after the Second World War. And I think my version is an improvement of Keynes' version because Keynes' version still equal banker, but it's still linked to a basket of commodities. So it's still commodity-based. But my proposal is a fiat money, international supranational currency created by, issued by international monetary authorities. And this kind of money supply, the policy for the money supplies can be decided by a group of experts. Following the recommendation of Freeman, K% rule, K percentage rule, were Taylor's revised. The Keynes original, Milton Friedman recommendation was a money supply according to the growth in the real economy. Then people later change a little bit. Taylor improved a little bit, say you also need to take into consideration of trade. So anyway, it's a percentage rule. If we adopt this kind of money I call paper gold, every country treat those kind of fiat money as their reserve, like the reserve gold, and they issue their own domestic currency based on this reserve. If they can do that, I think this arrangement can avoid all the drawbacks that I can consider of. First, this paper gold can increase according to the needs of real economy or international trade. And we know that if you use gold as a reserve, there's some kind of deflationary pressure if you have a dynamic growing economy. And this kind of paper gold will not have that problem. Secondly, it can avoid the conflicts of national interest and global interest because it's a supranational currency. And it can also avoid the trouble we observe in the Southern European country. Currently, Southern European countries use euro, so they do not have their own domestic currency. And so, at the current situation, they need to devalue their currency to create a space for structural reform. They cannot do that because they don't have their independent national currency. But in my system, every country can have their own independent national currency, although their currency money supply will be, based on their reserve of this paper gold. And this proposal is better than any other alternative I can come across now. But certainly you will ask whether it's going to be accepted or not, because Keynes' proposal theoretically was much better than to use the US dollar as a reserve, but Keynes' proposal was not accepted. But time is different, right? In the post-war period, US alone contributed to more than 50% of global GDP. And the US was growing very dynamically at that time. So everyone had confidence on the US at the time. But now, time is different. I think that by the time of 2030s, I would say we are going to have maybe 3 blocks, US, China, and the Eurozone. Each contribute to around 20% of global GDP. None was dominating as the US did in the post-war period. That's one thing. And I did not have time to elaborate it. I would say by the time, almost all these 3 blocks, each has its own structural problems. And since they have structural problems, it would give a lot of opportunity for the speculators to say this country or these blocks is too risky. Let's move to the other blocks. And so you're going to see some kind of situation like musical chairs. All of a sudden, all the international capital would go into one country and dump one country. And then if they did that, certainly the country which the capital outflow too large is going to be hurt seriously. They are going to have financial crisis. But if you receive too much capital inflow, you're going to have bubble in real estate, in equity. At the same time, you're going to have currency appreciation. Once you have currency appreciation, the real economy was hurt. And then you're going to have another one of this kind of outflow. So at that time, all the reserve currency countries, they are going to suffer from this kind of very volatile mobility of capitals. And certainly, it's not good for the non-reserve currency country. So there's a possibility. By that time, everyone will be hurt. So to have a better design on the table for people to discuss will be entertained. And I do not say my proposal will be accepted in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time, but I think we need to prepare something in the future. Especially, we need to put some cards on the table and to say what would be desirable for the high-income country point of view, for the developing country point of view. Because in the past, all the cards on the table are coming from the advanced country. And those cards, in general, they have embedded Western interest towards high-income country. So I think that it's time for us to propose something new, and which is good for the developing country, as well as good for the high-income country. Thank you. And the book called Against the Consensus.
I'd like to thank Dr. Lin for a very important lecture. If I could just summarize, the lecture consists of 3 parts. In the first part, he's given us his own analysis of the causes of the so-called Great Recession of 2008. And he said that, unlike the American explanations, East Asia was not responsible for the crisis, that the root of the crisis can actually be traced back to the country that issues the reserve currency of the world, the United States. His second part of the lecture is to make what he called a win-win proposal to revive global growth, which is to get all the countries in the advanced world to help develop infrastructure in the developing world. His third part of the lecture, which is very fascinating, I'm not sure how it will work, is that it is no longer politically tenable to use the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, because the US share of world GDP has declined from a peak of 50% down to about 25, right? We'll probably go down to 20%.
24% now.
24% will probably go down to 20% by 2030. And so Dr. Lin is suggesting replacing the US dollar as a reserve currency by a new reserve currency. I'm not sure who will issue this, IMF or who, but which he called paper gold. And it will be issued by each country which has reserves. And the amount of paper gold you can issue is commensurate to the amount of your reserves. Yeah, I think that's your proposal, right?
Yep, right.
How it will work, I'm not sure. So I invite questions. Donald, you want to ask the first question? And then Professor Muller, second question.
I think I can shout loud enough. So yeah.
Okay, wait, let me ask Donald. Would you allow him to potong jalan?
Sure.
All right. No, you go first.
And there's a mic over here.
Okay, Donald, why don't you go first?
Thanks very much, Prof Lin. I enjoyed your presentation very much, but would I be right in saying that your proposals very much hark back to the attempt at the end of 1945 to create a Bretton Woods consensus? Yeah. And the outcome of that consensus was the creation of the World Bank and the IMF. And the big conventional wisdom of the World Bank back in the 50s and 60s was that poor countries were poor because they lacked capital stock. And so the way to enable them to take off was to inject capital. And I see a lot of parallels between what you propose in terms of capital injection, infrastructure investments in developing countries to that consensus back in the 50s and 60s. But we all know what happened to the consensus of the World Bank in the 50s and 60s. The capital injections in developing countries did not lead to takeoff, led to very poor infrastructure choices. And also if you look at today's context, where the Western economies are pursuing loose monetary policies, where is all that capital flowing to? It's not flowing to the poorest countries. It's flowing to countries like Singapore, China, middle income and high income countries, where it's leading to real estate bubbles. So how would you coordinate and engineer a situation where, yes, you have that investments and the injection of capital, but you channel it to places where the returns, where you think it gives the biggest boost to development? I'm not sure that institutionally the world is set up to achieve that. On the IMF part of the Bretton Woods consensus, Keynes's idea was indeed to have it tied to some form of, but in the end it was back to US dollar, and US dollar was backed by gold. And that collapsed as well. And here we see a revived, improved version of it. I agree with Tommy that realistically, politically, I'm not sure how that's going to be engineered. And whether how would you constrain countries' discretion in terms of issuing the paper gold? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, maybe I collect two questions first. Otherwise, it will take 20 minutes to explain those two questions.
3 questions.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Professor Muller.
Thank you very much, and that was a fantastic lecture. And I would like to sign up and be part of a new consensus. And I find it very hard to disagree with anything you said. So let me tell you why I think that it will not happen. And that is because the largest, strongest economy, let's also call it the most dynamic economy in the world, is also the largest debtor. That means that the United States will not join such a policy because it cannot. According to the Congressional Budgetary Office, the net interest payments on the federal budget is now 1.4% of GDP. 10 years from now, it will be 3.4% of GDP, corresponding to 20% of the federal budget. That means that from now on, US policy will be directed at shifting the adjustment burden to the creditor countries. We can see that they criticize China, now they start to criticize Germany. In view of that, I cannot see them rally to a policy that consists of channeling funds to developing countries, even if you can argue substantially that it would also benefit the US. I don't think that they will be able to swallow that.
Yeah.
So that's the main reason I don't think.
Thank you.
And
I see
one more short note, and that is that I wrote my thesis at the University of Copenhagen in the 1960s about the reform of the international monetary system. Nothing has changed. And I think that we will end up with a commodity-based international reserve currency.
Thank you. Thank you, Joren. Is that enough? Take one more?
One more, yeah.
Okay. Why don't you take the microphone from Professor Miller?
Okay, thank you, Professor Lin. Actually, I graduated from CCER, Peking University, and two very quick questions. One, two questions about the structural reform that you mentioned in your presentation. One is that, can you elaborate about the structural reform and your advice to the countries which are hit by the crisis, like Southern European countries? And second question is about China. And it seems like that Chinese government has shown very strong commitment in the structural reform in the Chinese economy. And so how long do you think that it would take the Chinese government to restructure the economy and reboost the economic growth? Thank you.
Okay, very good. I think all those questions are very valid. And when I wrote my book, certainly I pay attention to questions like that. For example, you say in the post-war period, the Bretton Woods institution was created to support the development in the developing country. But they had a wrong idea at that time, right? Because at that time they were influenced by the structuralism. They advised the developing country to develop the largest scale of modern industries, just like in China. Try to catch up the US in 15 years and to overtake UK's in 10 years and the US in 15 years, right? And so those kind of projects certainly would be quite relevant. And so that's the reason why I think we need to change ideas. And if you look into the successful country, they always move step by step. Like East Asian economies in the 50s, 60s, they developed traditional labor-intensive small-scale industries, but they were competitive. But at that time, it was considered as wrong policy, right? But it was successful. So we need to change idea. That's the reason why I published another two books to advise the developing country, if they want to grow dynamically, they need to rely on their competitive advantages. And their competitive advantage are either in natural resources or labor force. And so they need to develop labor-intensive industries. And if they have natural resources, then they need to use the natural resources right to support the development of the non-resources industries and so on. So if they have the right ideas, they can grow dynamically. So that's one thing. And secondly, certainly now most capital came into China and Singapore because the other developing countries still did not know how to grow their country dynamically. If they follow my recommendation, they will grow dynamically, then the capital will go to those countries also. Anyway, we started to observe that. Some African countries follow my recommendation, and they saw the result within 1 year. They have so many quick wins, right? Okay.
Like Rwanda?
Like Rwanda and also Ethiopia. Yeah. And I'm working with the Ethiopia and Rwanda to help them to develop this East Asian type of strategies. Yeah. And then whether, there are two questions are similar, whether my proposal will be acceptable or not. Currently, it's not acceptable now because US still is the largest economy in the world. US still contribute to more than 23% of global GDP. US still have the veto powers in the United Nations, in IMF, in the World Bank. So US would not easily give up its preferential position. But here I'm talking about not now. I'm talking about 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And if US would not get out of their structural problems, they are going to have a lost decade like Japan. And their share to the GDP is going to declining. And if they wanted to maintain the reserve currency status, that means that they need to have liberalization in their capital accounts. And that will give opportunity for all kinds of speculation, large outflow, large inflow, and so on. And especially if Chinese yuan also becomes one reserve currencies, and Chinese will appear to be growing dynamically. So you are going to see a lot of capital outflow from the US to China. And the US economy is going to have a crisis. And certainly China will have a crisis soon also. And that kind of situation will cause every country to have a musical chair in the sense of one crisis followed by another crisis, and it's bad for everyone. So certainly I fully agree. My proposal will not be acceptable. Just like your proposal in the Copenhagen Consensus about new international monetary system, not only in the Copenhagen Consensus, also in the United Nations report headed by Stiglitz. They will not accept that now. But what they will not accept now does not mean they will not accept 10 years or 20 years from now. And especially if they would not accept this kind of better arrangement, their country may be marginalized, right? We remember that China contributed to 1/3 of global GDP, even up to the time of 1820, right?
Yeah, 1820.
And China dropped down to less than 5% within 1 century. And if the U.S. would not want it to reform its economy, to regain its competitiveness, that might be another scenario that U.S. needs to consider. And so what people will not accept now does not mean they will not accept in the future. And that is the reason why I think that we need to prepare for that intellectually. We need to put something on the table, and people will be very suspicious to say, well, theoretically it's right, but if you look into the geopolitics, then it's not acceptable.
Sure.
I agree, it's not acceptable now, but we need to prepare that. That is the function of intellectual, right? Then coming to whether China will run the same problem as in Southern European countries. I think that the Chinese government is looking very carefully about the experiences in other countries and try to avoid that. That's one thing. And I think the possibility for China to avoid that is very high. Because if you look into other developing countries, most crises is triggered by the currency mismatch. They borrow foreign countries' money. And when the crisis hit, they did not have the ability to repay the loan. And that is the beginning of the crisis, right? But China will not have those kind of currency mismatch because all the investment, no matter in the real sectors or in real estate or others, are all domestic loans. And China had 3.7 trillion reserves. So I don't think that similar crisis will occur in China because as long as you can avoid currency mismatch, then the national government always has some means to overcome the problem. Just like this time in the U.S. The crisis was triggered in the U.S. But among the high-income countries, U.S. was less affected because U.S. currency is a reserve currency. So they can always have QE1, QE2, QE3, QE4, QE5, and to smoothing their domestic economy. And I think that China has a similar advantages, at least in the coming years.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's take three more questions. I think you put up the hand first. Huh? You. Then let's take some questions in the back. You and you. 3 more questions, and then we'll take another third round of 3 questions.
Prof, thank you very much.
Please.
Yeah, and due regard and respect for Professor Lin, a fantastic topic. But I think that it's sometimes towards your conclusion, it's very philosophical. And I think that, when you talk about replacement, I think I was involved also. Prior to Mahathir decided to go on the gold dinar, of which, it didn't take off because to save him, Iran came and backed him up. But Iran doesn't have the gold. And the gold came from the Gold Council in Singapore. But Iran is a sponsor. And that's about the end of the story. Now, the question when you talk about the fundamental mismatch and the inconvenient truth, the question common sense doesn't prevail in the West, and it's not going to be prevail in the future unless they tend to correct themselves. So if they could not, and you try to do a replacement or alternative for that matter, but the root problems remain to be, then it will not be. We suggested world dollar, we suggested wild dollar, we suggested many dollar, not paper dollar. But it's still, the question of that practicality is another matter.
But question, okay, that is not the same questions.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll leave it to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. Questions from the back, please. I think let's take all the questions because we are already 6:30. So
Professor Lin, I have 2 questions. First is that you mentioned China has no external balance because of huge foreign exchange reserve. But we noted that from 2007 to 2013, in 2012, in 5 years' time, China's internal debt to GDP ratio has risen from 120% to 190%, which is not only unprecedented in Chinese history, but it's also very rare in international monetary history. Now, if you look at the experience of Japan, so it proves that sometimes these internal imbalances can also drop you down very substantially, just like what happened to the last 20 years in Japan. They run a huge current account deficit with a huge international reserve, but the economy just slowed down so significantly. So I want to ask your view on that. And second is that this monetary authority of issuing paper currency or whatever is one of the supreme manifestation of sovereign powers. So are we ready to give up sovereign powers so that international administration like IMF can perform the role of currency issuers? And secondly is that in the case of ECB, if you have a supranational agency that issue reserve currency, but at the same time it has monetary authority without fiscal authority, can this thing be sustainable? And last is that the US account now for 24% of world GDP, but its reserve account for 63% of international reserve. Now we have seen in the 1960s, when the sterling lost the reserve currency status, there's a very significant loss of wealth for those sterling holding countries, which Singapore counts as one of them. So how are we going to prevent this very potentially destruction of international wealth, reserve wealth effect, in case there's a new system that's going to take place? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Microphone first.
Thanks a lot. My name is ZD from here, the US SDE. And I have two questions. First, as you said, I think it's very interesting you said about the infrastructure can be a tool to developing countries develop their economic future. Also, the climate change, this issue, it can also be a tool for the developed country like Europe and the special Europe. They want to link kind of the framework in future. So I just think about this, link together, and how you think about this, or competition each other. And then other question about China, because we see China still on very fast range, and there is opinion about China because we have a lot of the land, the rural land, and the laborers out of market. Now they join the market, and this is why this is the generation, this kind of the power of Chinese economic. So it can still be working next 30 years. So how do you think about this opinion? Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I think somebody in the back. Yeah. Can you use this microphone, please?
Good evening, Professor Lin. My name is Wu Ming-Kong. Great to see you here. I just finished our class on economic growth, and our student here also. And because our courses use your...
I enjoy reading your books.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. You use actually your paper and books intensively in our course. And my question actually related to the second proposal about actually the world have to work together to address the issue of infrastructure. And I think it's a brilliant point, because now the world address the very severe bottleneck, and a lot of value can come from our coordination and our win-win mentality. So very good thing. So I think you have great experience with China and the World Bank. So can you share with us, actually, suppose now we have to develop some kind of mapping of infrastructure project around the world to see what kind of project actually have higher return and actually most urgent, and actually can create a stronger momentum for every country. So that, okay, before we make a decision, we have a strategy about infrastructure development for the own country. So suppose we think about port, road, airport, rural development, whatever, and have suppose China want to help India to address issues. So what kind of project you should go first, for example?
Right.
That will be very, very valuable for all of us.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions in the back? Yes, please.
Hello, Professor. I have two questions. The first one is, you have mentioned in the beginning of your presentation that about the China manipulation of its exchange rate. And you mentioned that in 2003, China runs trade surplus smaller than after 2005. When in 2005, the RMB began to appreciate, but the trade surplus became large. However, I think if I were the U.S., I will argue that it's not the relationship between the trade surplus and the exchange rate did not happen concurrently. I think it might be some kind of historic. Yeah. So I don't think there is directly related, just as you mentioned. So what do you think of this point? And the second one is someone has already asked you before that about the paper gold, and I think it's more like a political process than a economic process about the international monetary reform. Because I think in 2009, Zhou Xiaochuan has mentioned about the SDR, and he supported SDR as an anchor of the monetary system. But at that time, Obama just opposed that the American economy is very strong, and there is no need to adopt SDR or support any other currency like RMB. But my question is that what do you think of the role of SDR and paper gold? Is there any comparison between the two? Is there any difference between the two? And I think it's also related to the basket of goods you have mentioned that will decide the value of the paper gold. But what kind of the basket of the goods? And do you think there will be a mismatch between the basket of goods and the paper gold?
Well, I think your two questions are all explained in my talks. Maybe I spoke too fast, and you did not follow, because
I think maybe we should just allow Dr. Lin to respond to the question, and he will stay for a few minutes to have a drink with you. You can ask him privately.
Yeah, because I mentioned SDR is a basket of national currencies, and mine is a supranational currency.
Supranational, yeah.
That's one thing. And secondly, I already explained the difference between the banco and also the paper gold. Banco is linked to a basket of commodities, and mine is a fiat money, so it did not, link to any commodities. So I explained that, and sorry, maybe I spoke too fast. You did not follow. Then I come into most of the questions are similar questions. Whether my proposal will be accepted or not. In the past, U.S. was so powerful, and so U.S. has all kind of other power. If U.S. will not agree, then nothing can happen. I agree with you, that was right. But let's consider, I was humble to say by the time of 2030, U.S. would have about 20% of GDP. Global GDP, China would have about 20%. Very likely by the time of 2030, the GDP in China will be a combination of U.S. and Europe. And by the time of 2040s, China will be a combination of Japan and the U.S. and Europe. And at that time, does the U.S. still hold the greater power? I don't think so. And my proposal is to prevent China to follow to the similar mistakes as the U.S. now had. Because if you use your national currency as a reserve currency, it's very hard to have a discipline, self-discipline. Because all the politicians, they run the policy platform for their domestic needs. And if you use your national currency as a reserve currencies, you have the global obligations. But starting from the US, and we can look at other examples, it's very hard to have those kind of discipline. And without discipline, certainly it's not good for China and for the world. So we need to consider something which can avoid that. I know my proposal will not be entertained by the US politicians now, but it does not mean the US politicians will not entertain that in the futures. Because if China have a combination of Euro zone and the US, certainly China will be much more powerful. And at that time, I would say US would be very delighted if China started to propose, to use the super national currency instead of a national currency to be a reserve currency, right? So we cannot use the past experiences to project what is going to happen because the situation will be so different in the futures. Then coming down, you say the Chinese economy started to slowing down, since 2010. But I think it's cyclical because we know there are three drivers for the growth in China and in any other countries. The first one is export. The second one is investment. The third one is consumption. But because of the global economy has not pulled out of the crisis, the export growth rate in China dropped significantly. Secondly, investment. In 2008, China had started this 4 trillion yuan counter-cyclical intervention. Most of them went into investment. And after 4 or 5 years, most of those kind of projects completed. So if China did not increase the investment, certainly, then the investment growth rate will drop. And only consumption maintained at a very dynamic rate. But you used to have 3 drivers of growth, and now you only have 1 driver of growth. And that's the reason why the growth rate in China dropped. And a similar situation occurred in all the high-performing countries, including Singapore. If my memory is right, in 2010, your growth rate was 14%. And then in 2011, your growth rate was about 7%. Then 2012 dropped down to about 2%. And this year, if you're lucky, you're going to have 2 or 3%, right? And so you have a similar pattern of growth, like in China. And a lot of that was cyclical issues. Yeah. So I think the growth potential in China is still very high. And I'm going to give another talk at SMU tomorrow. If you're interested about the Chinese economy, you can come. And I'll explain. China still has the potential to maintain around 8% growth rate in the coming decades. And other, I think, seminar always said, well, whether my proposal will be acceptable or not. And I said, my proposal will not be accepted now, but it does not mean my proposal will not be entertained 10 years from now. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to... I'd like to, on your behalf, thank Dr. Lin for a very important lecture. His proposal of this paper goal may seem too remote and unreal, but he's thinking very long term. And he's drawing our attention to the fact that the relationship, the power relationship between China, the United States, and Europe are rapidly changing. And he's thinking 10, 20, 30 years forward, when the Chinese economy may be larger than those of Japan, Europe, and Japan combined. And he's in fact saying that it would not be good when that moment comes for China to then replace the United States and to dominate the world in the way the United States had dominated the world, and for the Chinese national currency to be used as the world's reserve currency. So he's saying that it's better if we have a supranational policy, a currency, and he's suggesting paper gold as one such possibility. So I think he's helping us to think long term, and he's actually arguing something that requires an enlightened approach by the Chinese leaders. I would like to thank you, Justin, very much. I don't have a present to give you, except
friendship is the best.
Big applause from the.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.